Awesome. Next up, we have Matt Schonwald. He is part of our NWAC's professional observer team, and he's the owner of BC Adventure Guides and has published ski books for 3 areas in Washington using the Canadian 8 scale to better understand consequences of avalanche hazards and exposure to avalanche terrain. He's been spending the last couple years digging into avalanche fatalities, and he's going to go ahead and present on Pacific Northwest avalanche fatalities. So let's welcome Matt to the stage.
Yeah, thanks to Sherry and NWAC for allowing me to present. And thanks for Jordy for really giving me the best lead-in ever. I mean, you would think I'm going to show you a bunch of numbers, but we actually have old information about this arousal issue. And I'm not sure how many people here are familiar with Barry Blanchard, but he did a trip to a place called Nanga Parbat, and it didn't go well. You know, there's a lot of near misses, and they walked away by the skin of their teeth. And he describes meeting the Minister of the Interior, and whatever that, and he was like, "How did your trip go, Mr. Blanchard?" And he was like, "It was like having sex with death." And I think that's important because when we look at numbers, we're not really seeing the people, but it does speak to the fact that maybe our partner is terrain, and maybe that day we're picking the wrong partner. So as we go into this, I just want to also bring up the idea that when we look at accidents, we're not trying to blame the victim. We're trying to examine the circumstances that brought them to that place. Because one of the hardest parts about being in an accident or being a victim is being able to talk about it without judgment. And that's what we're trying to achieve by just looking at where these accidents are happening, and maybe we can make choices that won't have the same result. So, and one of the other things that's really amazing is that Washington has quite a few accidents. You know, we would actually, if it was an Olympic event, we get bronze. You know, so since 1951, since the CIAC has had these statistics, you know, we are behind Colorado and Alaska. And for this study, I actually had read a blog post, which was a study done by Drew Hardesty that inspired me to look a little deeper into our accidents. And as it turned out, there hadn't been a previous study. Drew did his on avalanche accidents in the modern era in Utah. And it was really enlightening to see how we went about it. And, you know, some people were like, you dug into turns all year? I did. I feel dirty, but I felt like I came out on the other side better than I started. You know, you can see the sources. I'm welcome to. I read through every snowy torrents 3 times. So, but one of the things I wanted to introduce with the One of the things I wanted to introduce was the avalanche terrain exposure scale. So this is a minute, but this will kind of frame our discussion on how we talk about terrain.
Simple terrain is basically areas where there's lots of options to hide from avalanche hazard. So you can travel through trees and you can completely avoid avalanche hazard in that area if you pick your routes carefully. Challenging terrain, you're more exposed to avalanche hazard and there's less options for you to choose. You're still sort of dealing just with one hazard or one path at a time. Complex terrain is generally high alpine where you can have multiple avalanche paths coming together and threatening one area. There's not really much options in terms of completely avoiding avalanche hazard. So it takes more skill basically to maneuver through this terrain and make sure that you don't expose yourself.
Did everyone understand that? The accent? Did everyone hear simple, challenging, complex? So to frame our discussion and how we look at terrain, it really helps to understand how exposed are you in a given slope, a given run, a given climb. And you know, when we look at Granite Mountain, for example, it's one of the most dangerous mountains statistically in the US. And they even said this at ISSW and Telluride. So, you know, you have 7 fatalities since the 50s, but you see they're not very far from one another. They're actually clustered within 200 to 300 feet. So we're seeing a repetition. And the thing is, that is textbook complex terrain. You have multiple avalanche paths converging. So we look at another piece of terrain where we do see some fatalities. And, in this circumstance here, there was a foot or two of new when this avalanche occurred. And, the question is not whether it was triggered naturally or artificially, but the fact that you were there, was there a chance that you could avoid it or survive it? And, so in complex terrain, we see the survivability being questionable at best. And this is a friendly face to most people. This is the standard route to go up the big white one. So most people who've climbed Rainier probably have set foot on the DC. However, it's also the most dangerous route. You look at it, and it's complex by every textbook definition, and you're exposed to avalanches from the time you leave Camp Muir, actually till you get to over 12,000 feet. So there's really no way to avoid it, and when we see it, we see it, 17 fatalities, and even if you discount the 11 victims in 1981, you still see a large number of people getting caught in a pretty specific piece of terrain. Now, looking at regions, we could look at it and say, well, obviously, Rainier has a lot of people because of that one, but we do see that historically, we have Snoqualmie Pass. Snoqualmie Pass has easy access and lots of activities to engage in, so clearly it's a place that people go out in large numbers. And then Rainier is also, it's been a national park for over 100 years. People have been climbing it for longer than that. And we see the same on Baker. And now the troubling thing is just trying to figure out, well, who are we missing? And, if you look on the east side to what we call the Cascade East Central and Cascade East North area, the forecast for NWAC, that's where we do see different snowpacks and different victim profiles. So when we look at the avalanche distribution, we see that it covers quite a bit of the state in terms of accidents, but this is part of a GIS group from Integral GIS, and they helped put this together. Now, red being the skiers and blue being climbers, we do see clusters around certain areas or certain peaks. And if we take a closer look at Rainier, and we look at gray being complex, this being challenging, this being simple, we do see the climbers, they're in complex terrain because that's where the climbs are. They're above tree line. And we do see that, skiers are clustered around Crystal. That makes sense. Not a lot of climbing terrain, but it's a great place to go skiing. Now, what we see in the blue and the yellow, though, is actually avalanches that happened outside the forecast season, which is May and June. And then the yellow represent naturals, meaning like not only were they climbing in spring and summer, but they were actually hit by natural activity. So, were they in the wrong place at the wrong time? Now, when we look at that too, we can see similar things in Baker, and so that's where when we look at this, we got to see that there's a pattern of use that repeats itself. And so when we look at our climate, with the amount of avalanche fatalities, shouldn't a maritime snowpack be safer, being more uniform, deeper, more predictable? And so, but statistically, that certainly is not the case. We get a bronze medal. We're in third place. So, and when we look at avalanche types, we do see that, yes, we have a large number of avalanches that are directly related to weather, storm and wind. However, when we look at persistent, deep, and glide and wet slabs, we see more complex problems that make up over 20% of our accidents. And so that can be, we can look at that regionally. But then, one of the things we want to look at is also the terrain and the avalanche rating when these problems are occurring. When you look at this, the first thing that stares at you is the out of forecast season. And that's in complex terrain, and so when you look at that, that's a lot of people. And when you break that number down, it's almost entirely climbers. And so when we look at other areas for like high and moderate, we see people going out into very difficult, challenging, and complex terrain and during high hazard. And when we look at that, we might see that they're not all skiers. There are actually quite a few snowshoers and climbers in there. Considerable, we accept that that's a challenging time for people. But, when we look at the problems, that's where we see persistent problems. We do see it in moderate and high too. So, it's not exactly looking for causality so much as just seeing when these things are occurring. But then when you look at by user, clearly climbers are in trouble. 40% is a pretty big number. So that's where we want to make sure that we're addressing the people that are getting hurt. So when we look at that, we can kind of break it out. And climbers are where you expect them. They're on Baker, they're on Shuksan, they're climbing in the winter, Mountain Loop, Rainier. Strangely though, snowshoers are right, in Washington are also a leading statistic naturally for getting caught and killed. And we see that at Mount Rainier around Pan Point and also around Source Lake, around Snoqualmie. Whereas snowmobilers are our persistent slab victim group, and we see them where we expect in the east side, but we also see them in Baker and Snoqualmie with persistent slabs. So here's a breakdown of climbers. We see that out of 182 nationally since 1951, we make up a third. We make up almost 30%. And Alaska, we're pretty close. We share that burden well. Now, in Colorado, you see 30, but when you actually look at it by month, it's much different. You see that Washington makes up a large chunk of people getting caught and killed in spring and summer. And you see that it's not by a small margin. Alaska makes sense, but Washington, Colorado's not even close. You're talking single digits. Their accidents are happening in traditional months of avalanche activity, January. So when we look at it, we want to just focus on terrain choice. And terrain choice being, where are people getting caught naturally? And if they are going in lower hazard, are they misreading the problem? And the key thing here is that terrain equals consequence. So I just want to end sort of with this idea that, are we maritime all the time? Do we have this snowpack that is easier to predict? And then the fact is that we get storms all times a year. So we have a foot of new 2 feet in June. That still presents slab problems. And, in climbing, terrain equals consequences. Sex with death. Pick the wrong partner and it ends poorly. And the last one, I just leave it as an open question. So yeah. There's a lot of people I like to thank. There's groups, the Avalanche Center, the American Alpine Club for helping, people at Colorado, Drew Hardesty for helping shape this, Integral GIS for helping put together the data on maps. But thanks for listening.
It's snuck behind you.
What?
We have time for a couple questions. Anybody? Oh, I see a hand in the middle there. Was that a hand? Oh, nope. Nope. Put it down. Okay. Ooh. We have one over here. And we have blue plaid. I was more specific about my plaid.
I like that. Yeah.
Thanks. And then over here.
I was wondering, with the fatality statistic, you had other problems twice. What was the breakdown? Why did you have other problems listed twice? You had persistent slab, deep slab, other.
Oh, it was in, the two categories were in challenging and complex terrain. Others were basically storm, wind slabs, loose wet, just weather related. So rather than persistent slab types.
Cool. And then we have a question over there.
Yeah, I have a question over here, actually.
Oh, cool.
I was wondering if some of this, when you look at the number of avalanche fatalities, say in Colorado, I would presume there are probably more skiers in Colorado than maybe even Washington, just because it's a much bigger destination. And this maybe extends to some of the other presentations. How much are these statistics informed by the number of users? Obviously they are, but how does that balance out in terms of the number of people actually skiing? It seems that there are more people skiing, there may be more risk of avalanche deaths, or that kind of thinking.
I think if you were to look at the last 10 years and compare the numbers between Colorado and Washington, the number of fatalities is actually a lot closer. If you look at, the longer you go out, the greater the disparity between regions. But if you look at the last 10 years, Washington's numbers, and there's no real accurate number for actual backcountry users. I didn't bring up near misses because they're statistically hard to put a lockdown that this is exactly how many near misses there are, since it's self-reported. But I think if you look back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, that may be true. But in the last 10 to 15 years, Washington's backcountry use probably is on par with Colorado, if not more. And I think there's NWAC web data to show that there's more clicks, more use of the website. So I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but I looked at fatalities strictly for this. So that fatality to fatality, which was easier to look at and understand.
All right, and that wraps up your time. But thank you, that was awesome. So give it up for Matt. Give it